Right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lori Soul, and I am on the South Dakota Statewide Geospatial Conference Committee, as well as working for the City of Sioux Falls and South Dakota State University. Really happy to have you all here today. I've been manning the workshops today, and it has been an absolute blast. I've enjoyed every one, so I have every expectation that this one will be equally amazing. Some ground rules are there are no ground rules. I will be making everybody a panelist, and I have spoken with our presenter, and so we may ask questions in the chat or we can unmute ourselves as needed. So I encourage everybody to do so. So let's get started. It is 1 o'clock, or at least it is where I am. This is a Python workshop, and this will be presented by Frank Parker, who is with Banner Associates. Frank is a GIS analyst, and he has 5 years of experience in GIS working on civil engineering and asset management projects for rural communities. Frank has degrees in architecture, geographic information systems, and computer programming. He will introduce the world of Python using ArcGIS Online notebooks, starting where to start writing code to how to debug. He does have some requirements, and I'm sure he'll go into more details as we go along. Must have access to ArcGIS Pro notebooks and a Gmail account. So let's get started. I will keep an eye on the chat as needed and will help facilitate. Otherwise, I'm going to go dark, but reach out anytime, anyone in the chat if you need anything at all from me. Take it away, Frank, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
Okay, great. Yep, let's jump into it. So I like to name this "Who Doesn't Like Py?" I think a lot of us want to use Python. If we don't want to use it directly, we know that there's people that benefit from it, and we want to simplify things all the time. And so I kind of went down this road when I first started GIS. Just went to SDSU and started learning a little bit about GIS and its relationship to architecture. And then I was finding different types of interoperability and things like that. And I just found it so difficult. It felt like I was navigating so many different softwares to access data. And anyways, as I continued my road down the civil engineering side of things, a lot of the work that I did wasn't necessarily like a GIS analyst. I wasn't using a whole lot of science, at least not right away. And a lot of it just seemed like it was requiring us to do more implementation, or like they just wanted software and things like that to go through and do their asset management. So I felt like I was just drowning and trying to figure out like, where do I start? How do I go about doing this? And so back in 2019, I discovered the Build Dakota Scholar program, which is through South Dakota. And so currently Banner Associates helped sponsor that to get me into that. And so I took on the venture of learning computer programming, and it just completely changed my understanding of how coding and programming aren't exactly the same thing. And it taught me a lot. And so anyways, I wanted to give it a go here and try to do a workshop on some very introductory type coding in Python. So the first segment of this will just be really, really slow. So if you have experience in writing any kind of code, just bear with me as we go through different things. We're going to discuss data types, etc. So I will just keep going into it. This is just a graphic kind of showing you like this is what it was like when I was first typing in code. I was going on Stack Overflow and I was like creating this Frankenstein type script all the time where it was good enough and it would do the job, but I didn't always know like what it was that I was putting together, or maybe there's better ways of putting it together. And I remember I had a script once in Visual Basic that was like, gosh, 600 lines, and I worked with somebody else on it, and we brought it down to about 30 lines. So uh, just really helped to learn coding. So for those of us that are unfamiliar with coding, each coding language has its own structure. So like in Python, we'll use tabs. spaces, enters, things like that to create new lines and go on to the next command. C uses brackets and semicolons, etc. There's two different types of, well, I'm sure there's more, but the two that I'm familiar with, there's low-level coding and they call it high-level coding. Low-level coding is like your machine type stuff. High-level coding is going to be more of your Python, C#. So we will be working with a high-level coding language today. Learning to program versus knowing a particular language. Just again, that's where I was learning. I was doing like what was that? That boot camp online. There's Coding Academy. There's another one. Those are great for learning how to just type basic strings and data and things like that, but it doesn't really paint the picture. And so today we're probably going to do more of that coding boot camp type style where it's not going to fully paint the picture, but hopefully I can introduce you to some concepts that maybe you'll spend your time researching later on. For example, we'll talk about like post and get requests, which is more of a programming function and less just about how to write code itself. A question I kind of ask myself too is it always seems like there's more and more programs out there where we don't need to know code. For example, some of us who watched Nicholas's presentation on the Power Automate with webhooks, you know, great presentation, and it kind of has you wondering like, how much coding do I really need to know when I have amazing things out there? Why not just use Model Builder and create scripts from that? I think there's something to be said about understanding how that data passes back and forth that would allow you to access data just outside of ArcGIS and other platforms and bring it in and really build yourself like a solid integrated program that works between everything. So step one, I guess we're gonna just jump right into it. If you don't have an Integromat account, let's just take some time here to go ahead and create one. So if you want to just go out to integromat.com, and I'll just go as slow as possible here. I will sign out of my account and just walk you through the steps of creating that account. If you think you're really comfortable with post requests and Power Automate or Zapier, if you want to use those, that's okay. But the demonstration I'm going to do today will be using Integromat. So yep, just click on sign up, and then you'll create a free account. So put your name, email, password, all that stuff. So while you're doing that, I can talk a little bit about Power Automate or webhooks. Webhooks is an automated way for us to basically get a request, which a request is when you have data and you want to send it over the internet, like HTML responses, things like that. You might have heard some of these terms. It's basically like sending a message from a browser to another entity or sending it off so it can process somewhere else. And so webhooks is one of the more common ways to do that without having to have like a full-on server or full-on website uploaded. It's kind of our messenger. So let's go ahead. Okay, so I will just go off screen for a second and check my email. So go ahead and just fill these out if it's required. Looks like it is. I will go ahead and put internal IT. Just gotta give them all your data on a scale of 1 to 10. Let's go ahead and put a 5. Continue. Okay. So if you are not at this point, go ahead and enter in the chat. Otherwise, I will just keep going. So now that we've created our Integromat account, let's see. Okay, so now we can open up ArcGIS Pro. So I will just go ahead and open tab. And so once you have ArcGIS Pro open, I guess the other requirement about your Arc Pro is it would have to be, I'm not entirely sure which version, but you would have to be up to date enough to have access to notebooks. So once we're there, I'm going to go ahead and start without a template. I'm completely okay doing that. If you want to, you can set up a project for yourself and save it out if you want to save this demonstration. I will go ahead and insert a new notebook. I will just give it a couple of seconds here. Okay. So one of the basic things about coding is you have different data types. You've got strings, you have arrays, lists. Well, no, objects aren't considered data types. In some cases, they call it a number, but it's mostly an integer, float, doubles, decimals. These all probably sound familiar to all of us working with databases inside of ArcGIS. Not much different. And the same rules apply, right? You can't add, well, you can concatenate two strings together using a plus, right? But it's not like you would be able to combine like you can't calculate a double, you can't calculate a string into a double field, right? Like some of us have probably come across that at one point where we have a bunch of numbers and it's in a string format. We try to calculate it into a decimal field or an integer field, long in that case, and it doesn't go. That's the same thing here. Same rules apply. So we'll go ahead and start jumping into this immediately. There is one part I guess I skipped. Let's talk about the notebook window before we start writing code. So you've got all these different functions as far as the notebook. The notebook is essentially just a way for us to write Python in different segments and keep track of it in cells. So in some cases, we'll want to like create a function. We'll talk about functions later on, where we'll group it all into one cell. Or we want to just piece it out so we can test code as we write it. Because a lot of times and I found this out the hard way a long time, is that if you're writing code and you're not testing it as you go, and then you go, and then you can't figure out what the problem is, or it takes forever to find out what the problem is because you're not running it line by line or function by function in order to figure out like what is going on with the code. So I personally love Notebook. It really helps me like test my code in segments without having to comment out sections, for example. And so you've got different functions here. Here's your cell in this case. This is your cell. So we can add new cells by just clicking through. We can delete those cells. We can move them up in priority or down. And we can run them individually. or in this case, we can come in here and we can, I think, run all cells this way. You know, if you copy a cell, you can paste it below. If you want to copy multiple cells, you can paste multiple cells below. This command function helps us if restarting a kernel, that's what they call this, when you run the full thing, you can interrupt the command by coming in here and typing interrupt the kernel in cases where you run a while loop, for example, or something that, again, we'll talk about what a while loop is later on, but say you run a piece of code that just runs forever, you'll want to interrupt it, otherwise it'll crash. You can insert cells below, above. Again, these are just some of the common commands, but if you feel like there's something you should be able to do, just come through here. This has got the full list. I think it's bearish, it's missing a couple of things. It would help to have like a stop button actually right here. So there's just it's a little bit of a downside to it, but some of us also might be familiar with Jupyter Notebooks. This is pretty much what this is just a plugin for it. So you should have it as part of some of the more recent versions of ArcPro. It's just embedded. You can find it in your catalog. So if you want to save a notebook, you certainly can. When I created it, see how it pasted it in here? If I want to rename it, I certainly can. There's some other things too. You can change it between code markdown. I don't know what this is. I haven't used it. Headings allow us to like make big phrases or statements. So we will start writing code, for example. Take that out because I don't care for it. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Another thing too, if you haven't seen in the new ArcGIS Online release, they have ArcGIS Online notebooks up there too. I specifically require that we do it through ArcPro because we can use our ArcPy library versus just being limited to the ArcGIS REST API. We'll mostly use ArcPy today, so yeah. Now that everybody's kind of familiar with how this goes, I'm going to go ahead and start going through some very basic coding examples. Again, for those of us that even know the basics of coding, this will be a little slow at first, so just bear with me. So let's go ahead and just start, right? So one of the functions in order to display your data, or something that I commonly use to check to see that my information's work, is the print function. The print function, you need a start and close parentheses. Again, a nice function of the notebook is you type in that left parentheses and it just goes, right? It puts in that end parentheses and we can keep going. Here's, if you've done some, basic classes, hello world. I don't know why that's a thing, but it's always been a thing in all my coding classes. So let's go ahead and print hello world. Hey, looks like it works. So next thing, let's go ahead and print a message. So variables is another thing we'll talk about. In order to create a variable in Python, it's really nice because if I want to create that variable, I can just type in, for example, message equals, and this is called a literal, it's called a literal string that we're typing, right? We need those quotes in order to define it as a string. So message equals hello world here. And now we want to print that variable. So we're actually just going to print the message. Now we have hello world, just like as we did before, except instead we're passing this variable into this function, print. So let's print message. The next thing we'll do is we will, let's see, oh, go ahead and leave your code. I got a little keyboard happy there and deleted that out. Above the variable message, create another variable called name. So let's send a message to somebody. In this case, I will just put my name. And so we're going to print the function and add together message and name. So how would we print out, how would we print out a message sent to Frank? Well, there's two ways to do it, right? We could, for some reason, we would do it this way, right? This is maybe how I would used to do it. Not really ideal. And instead, let's go ahead and concatenate these, combine the two. So I want to go ahead and say message plus name. Okay. Our message is still not quite what we want it to be, right? We want to have a space in there. So let's go ahead and do another concatenation. And so we will use, in this case, another literal string. In this case, just quotation space quotation. There we go. So let's keep going. Let's look at number, float, and integers, and we'll kind of experiment with some of the things that I was mentioning before about data compatibility types. So we're going to keep working with variables, so let's create a new cell. So I've already created a new cell. If you haven't, just hit this plus button up here. Cut that out. And let's move the print function into the new cell and leave the variables above. So let's take this function here and put it here. In the cell with the variables, let's write apples, oranges equals 4, 6. So I'm kind of teaching us two things at once here. So not only are we learning how to create integer values, but we're also going to create more than one variable at a time in one line of code. So apples, comma, and then space oranges. And so it works as in order. So we have apples as the first element and oranges as the second element. So we'll have apples, comma, oranges. So if we have 4 apples and we have 6 oranges, we should have 4, 6. And so now that'll correspond. Note how we didn't have to provide quotations, right? This is not a string variable. Python will interpret this as a integer. If we put a decimal, which we'll do in the next part, then it'll recognize it as a decimal. So apples and oranges are both integers currently. So now in the print cell, type apples plus oranges. Oh, if you get this error, right, like it's saying names apples is not defined, but we know it's defined up here. In that case, we should be running all our code, because if we change that previous cell and we don't rerun it, then it doesn't know. So now that I run all the cells, it's working again. So something to pay attention to as we're working through this. If you're getting errors, rerun all your code. So at the top, click on cells and then run them all. Okay, good there. Yep, and you should have 10. 10 should be the value. So rather than giving us a 4 and a 6, it actually added it using math. So now change your apples and oranges to 2.4 apples and 3 oranges. So let's go ahead and change that to 2.4 and 3. And so go ahead, just run it all again, run all if you need to. And we should have a value of 5.4. So again, we've got, we're able to add integers and decimals. They're both numbers. It works out great. So let's go ahead and try message and apples. So let's change this out and do message. It's apples. Let's see what happens. Can only concatenate string, not float to string. Doesn't like that. It's like, how do I add string? Like, what does apples plus 3 equal? Nobody knows. So we need to convert that so it will actually work. So, oh, yep. So go on to the next. Let's look at how we can combine strings with integers. So In order to do so, to convert any type of number or most types of values into a string to make the information compatible, we will have to add a string function in front of it. So let's type print I have, so in this case, I have now string apples, in this case, going to add another string because basically what I wanted this message to say is that I have 2.4 apples and 3 oranges. So if you want to beat me there, you certainly can. So I have 2.4 apples and yep. Second there. And as we do these two, it kind of trips me up when I'm writing code sometimes when I'm creating custom messages or doing an echo statement, something like that, to make sure I get spaces put in there in between my values. Okay, great. It says I have 2.4 apples and 3 oranges. Just what I wanted. So let's now that we kind of know the basics, right? We know strings and integers, but we don't know booleans yet. Or maybe you do personally, but at this point we have not talked about booleans. So they use boolean statements, meaning a true or false statement. And so these are your conditional statements. You might have heard people say this before. We'll just use a conditional statement. It's just a matter of if I have 3 apples, then I want 4 oranges. If I have 5 apples, I want 7 oranges. If I want this, I want that. And you can do else statements or else if statements, and we'll talk about how you do that in Python here. So let's go ahead and delete out that print message. And so we will go ahead and type in our if statement. So we talked a little bit about formatting earlier, right? Here's another thing about formatting. This equal sign is not just a singular equal sign. This is actually a Boolean test. When you are using an equal sign, it's not that it actually equals it, but it's assigning that variable that particular value. So if I put just this, it actually reads if the oranges assign variable 3. It doesn't make sense in our heads, right? Even just saying it out loud. But by adding that extra equal sign, we're actually testing that value. So if oranges equals 3, let's go ahead and print success. Otherwise, in this case, else, there is no else if in this case, because we're just saying that as long as it equals 3, it will always print success. As long as it doesn't equal 3, then it will print we need more or less oranges. And so we know that we have 3 oranges, so it should print success. Great. We have a successful run, and so next step. Oh, yeah, let's just take a second to review. Okay, so I did not mention the tab statement here. If we were to do this, right, and this is another great thing about this notebook is I think if I remember right, yep, expected and indented block. So again, this is just a little bit of debugging we can do as we go along. It says line 2. Okay, great. You may not be seeing these numbers, by the way. I think I have these turned on by default. If you don't have these turned on, I would suggest turning them on. Toggle line numbers definitely helps you a lot. So expected indented block line 2. I am missing an indent. So let's go ahead and run it. It's still going to tell me it's wrong because now on line 4 I'm missing an indent. So for every time you go into an if loop or a for loop, you always need to provide that indent. So let's hit run. It's working again. Great. Oh, and don't forget this colon, by the way. You need this colon. This colon is kind of like the indication of the next line with the enter. Anything we want to occur based on the Boolean must happen inside the if statement and vice versa. Yep, so we kind of already talked about that. Let's keep going. Also, this is not the only way to do this. If you care to learn about another function, it's called case or switch statements, depending on what language you're in. It allows you to basically test multiple variables using a singular if statement, where it just says it's much more simple writing. So we can continue to test different scenarios using else if. So let's go ahead and type between if and else, elif apples equals 2.4. So let's go down. Let's go elif 2, right? And so how do you go ahead and print, how do you like them apples? And so looks like our logic is working. And so let's go ahead and hit run, see what happens. Nothing, right? Nothing happens. So let's figure out what is going on. Let's go ahead and change that to 4. Let's see what happens. So see how it took the first condition that it met? So it said, okay, let's go through this first statement and see if it matches. If it matches, then we're good. We don't need to go through the rest of these. So if you haven't already, change this number, excuse me, from 3 to 4 in order to get this statement to run. And so let's just go ahead and make both these statements wrong, so we can see that it executes that last statement. So it goes in order. It's not just a random order. Okay. Another data type. Let's talk about lists. If anybody's familiar with arrays, in the case of Python, we use lists instead of arrays, right? So an array is essentially a collection of or a collection of strings, integers, whatever it is. Often to work with data sets, we need to know how to access the different parts of that data set. For example, if we have a list of groceries we need to buy and want to print that grocery list in a better format, we can. Lists do not change in ascending or descending order unless you program them to do so. For example, let's take a look at our first list. Let's go ahead and create a new cell below everything and let's generate a list. So if you haven't already, click that plus button for me. And let's keep going. So to create that list, let's type in grocery, right? Grocery equals, and you'll use a left bracket in order to indicate a list. You can just keep going if you want, and you'll notice that, hey, what the heck, there's nothing printing, right? That's perfect. You can use grocery to create a list with nothing in it. Sometimes we do that. In this case, we want to go ahead and actually add some groceries to our list. We're going to make a pretty tasty smoothie here. It's going to be apples. One thing that you'll notice is sometimes I switch between using single quotes and double quotes. Depending on what you're doing, you should always stick to a method. So I'll try to use double quotes here. So we'll do apples, oranges, strawberries. Yeah, just to quickly go over a topic here that I completely skipped over that I didn't think to mention, was that if you need to create a text or something that has quotes, watch what happens when I do this here. If I put quote here and I put quote here, it doesn't like that, right? It won't go. Yeah, it won't recognize this as a string, right? It actually recognizes that there's a blank here and that there's a blank here. So again, where I was coming from with saying that we need to be consistent with our coding is that in order to provide quotes for something, we can just use a singular quote there, or vice versa, depending on what you need it for. But being as consistent as possible is best. So I will go ahead and type in print Frank, and you will see that it actually prints Frank with quotations around it, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. Sometimes you run into that when you're trying to get like URLs or you need a directory. Often when you do work with directories in Python, you provided the \r, then you've provided the directory. Oh, sorry, no backslash in front of the R, just R, and then you provide the codes. Okay, so hopefully I didn't lose anybody, but we're gonna turn back to what we were talking about here with lists. So lists, in order to access the data, right? How do we go about doing that? Well, you have these indexes. This apples is actually an index of 0, oranges is 1, watermelon 2, and strawberries 3. It does start at 0, so that's something to keep in mind. So if you're ever looping through data, just remember that the first the first index in there is not 1, it's 0. So we will go ahead and do very simple visual of what this looks like. You can in fact print arrays, or excuse me, lists by simply just typing in print, right? That's great, right? Well, that's actually what it prints for the text though. So we don't want to pass data like this. Typically, we want to parse it, as they say, in order to get the data the way that we need it. So let's go ahead and look at different ways of parsing data. So in order to do so, let's access watermelon. If you think you can beat me there, go ahead. Let's go ahead and type in print grocery. And then just think for a second about what I said, right? Which index do we want? Which number? Well, watermelon is 0, 1, 2. Let's go ahead and access that. Perfect. We got our string watermelon. So now we know how to access the individual items within it. So how do we, how do we access this data as a group, right? Or how do we modify the list or make changes? So now say we want to modify the list to include new values. Say we need to add milk and to make an awesome smoothie. Erase the print strawberry portion, or in this case, print grocery, watermelon. Let's go ahead and back that out. We'll go ahead and do grocery.append milk. So what this will do is it'll actually tack it on to the end, but we won't actually see it, right? And let's go ahead and just type in print grocery so we can see our results. Ah, there it is. So now that this this grocery we have appended the milk to it, it's there as a global variable, so it'll be there the rest of the way down. So if we come down here and do it, or later in the expression we want to access the milk variable, we certainly can. So let's look at more indexes here. Bob is allergic to apples, so let's change apples to pears. So let's go ahead and go ahead and we can leave those in there, but let's type right above print grocery so we can see our results. Let's go ahead and type in grocery, and we will do 0. And so we will go ahead and assign, remember, singular equal sign there, assign the value of pairs to it. And then let's run that function. Notice how our apples is now pairs. That's exactly what we want. So let's keep going with lists. We're not quite done yet. Let's talk about a for loop. That's why it's relevant to lists. For loops can be run in JSONs, things like that. I think I have a segment in here on JSON. So once we get there, we'll talk a little bit more about what a JSON data format is. So with a single script, yep. So erase everything in this Excel except for the original grocery list. So let's go ahead and delete this out. To better understand how the for loops work, we will look at printing the variable that increases in count as we go through each iteration. So in this case,
Say, Frank, I apologize for interrupting, but I just saw a question come in and it went to me, so I wanted to make sure I got this out there.
okay.
Donna was wondering, do you have to use append for milk, or can it just be added to the first grocery line?
Yeah, it can be added to the first grocery line. Yep. I think maybe you're referring to this if you just want to add it in there.
Right.
Yep.
I think so.
Yep, you certainly can.
Thank you.
Yeah, there might be some things that some of us are watching me do, and you're like, there's so much a better way of doing this, or why would he do it like that? In that case of showing the append function, I just wanted to demonstrate in a very simple way of using the append function, and it is coming. We are getting there. We will look at most of these functions that I'm going over in an example of using ArcPy, and so that's why we talked about using the hydrant data, etc. But that was a very good question, because I know that that catches me off guard too sometimes. There's always a better or different way to do something, it seems like, especially when it comes to programming. So I'm definitely not, I've only been writing code like, I don't know, decently full time for like a year. So I'm still getting the hang of all this. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do the for loop. So just to catch us back up, if you haven't already, let's go ahead and delete everything but that grocery line. Let's go ahead and just do that. And so now let's do a for loop. So for X in grocery. And now this is kind of the question that I ask myself all the time when I first started this. What the heck is X? Like, where did X come from? What is this? Like, he didn't assign the variable, he didn't do anything. Why is he printing X? X in this case is that particular index of that list. And so by default in Python, which is different than a lot of other programs, is that, or programming language, is that we don't actually have to tell it how many times we want to loop through grocery. We don't have to tell it like that X equals 0. And so for every time we go through X that we need to like add it plus 1. Not really a good way of explaining that without exposing you to other code. But just know that when we go through this, it's for every indice. So X essentially in every time that it runs will be this index. So when it runs, it's actually going to run it 1, 2, 3, 4 times. It will print 4 times. And in this case, it will print apples. In this case, X is apples. The second time it runs, X will be orange. Third time would be watermelon, and the fourth time strawberries. So let's go ahead and hit run. Oh, and what do I have? String line 3 for X in grocery.
Need the lowercase 4 there.
I need a lowercase.
You got a capital F there.
Oh, in the for statement. Good. Yep, good catch. Thank you very much, whoever that was. Thank you. Okay. Yep. So for X in grocery, print X. So we went ahead and run the script, and you'll notice that in this case, apples, oranges, watermelons, strawberries all came out.
You might notice that it showed up in green too. That means that the notebook said, "Oh, that's a real for statement." Before when it was capital, we change it back to capital F, and they'll see how it changes back. The for make it uppercase F again in the for, and then you'll see how the parser kind of checks your code as you go. It'll, if you change it to capital F4, it would be it'd turn back to black.
Like that, right? Just like that. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was very helpful. Sometimes I kind of forget that that's even there. Okay, so we will keep going. Run the script, see how it prints. Yep. So it went ahead and printed the variables. And so in the for statement, the X is just a variable we created in Python, right? It could say anything. So if we wanted to say for fruits, right? These are all fruits. Let's go ahead and print fruits. It might even help to just make it singular in that case, because we know that it's a singular object. So for each fruit in grocery, print fruit. Okay, so let's look at, going to the next step. Let's implement what we've learned. Let's run a for loop with a Boolean, right? So in this case, let's take processing of the Boolean and look at how the indentation works and like how that lines up. So for X in grocery, so we want to go ahead and type actually. Oh yeah, I wanted to show you this too. Okay, bear with me for a second. So I was talking about earlier how in other languages you can actually create like a counter of some kind in order to keep track of each time you go through it, that this would be indices 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., or 0, 1, 2, 3, excuse me. And so let's go ahead and type right above here. Let's go ahead and just put count. It's 0. And so this will keep track of the number of loops that we go through. And so we want to go ahead and change this back to X just because that's what I've been using. And so for X in grocery, above this, we want to put if count is less than 2, run this function. So I need to have an indent. So for the for loop, you have to have an indent, and for the if statement, you would also have an indent. And so we come down here, and I actually need to go back and indent, and then create that else statement. So let's go print X must be fresh. So we know that apples and oranges, we don't care if they're fresh, but we want like the best watermelon and strawberries we can get. And so in order to actually get this condition to change, we need to keep track of how many times running that loop. So I'm going to add this. And so one thing I didn't explain was this little markup here is what it does is it'll take the current value variable and it will just like append it, right? Again, we're familiar with this term appending now. We're going to, in this case, add it though, because it's an integer. If it was a string, it would be appending, but because it's an integer, it's adding. So for every time it runs a loop, it'll be count equals 0, and then in this case, it'll equal 1, the next time 2, and then it'll come down here and do 3, 4, etc. So go ahead and run that. And so, right, it just prints the fruits because it says, you know, it's less than 2. In this case, we assigned a count of 0. And so it went ahead and printed apples, oranges, and then it knew that watermelons and strawberries must be fresh. So let's look at one more step. Let's make this a little bit more complicated. Let's look at how we access a loop or access a list within a list. Sometimes this will happen when you're working with especially JSON data or GeoJSONs, especially where you have a latitude and a longitude number, and it typically comes in either a tuple or a list. A tuple is a little bit different than a list. I did not take time to put together a whole lot on tuples, so we will be sticking to lists today. Just note that that is a thing and that's out there. So grocery, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead and erase everything in the cell except for the grocery list. We will end up modifying the grocery list, however. So let's go ahead and create a list of lists. So we already have a list, but now we want to provide a quantity for each of these fruits. And so I'm going to go ahead and put the brackets there. Let's go ahead and put a quantity of 3 for apples. Yeah, so this is where I was just going to go ahead and recreate the list. I'm sure there's a shortcut out there that works better than that, but it's just what I'm familiar with. So oranges, 2. Go ahead and make sure you're putting your commas in between your brackets. So okay, so looks like let's go ahead and just run that to make sure that I typed in my list correctly. If you didn't type it in correctly, unless of course you just had something else in there, you'll probably get an error. I know earlier I had like quotes around 2 when I first did my demo run of it, so it's easy to get tripped up on things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and print the grocery items. And so let's look at what happens when we print just the lists. So let's look at how it looks in just a list. So for X in grocery, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and print grocery. So watch what's going to happen, right? It just prints the list over and over and over. That's not actually what we want. What we want to do is we want to go ahead and actually access those variables. So if we put an X there, we're going to get an error because we need to create range value. So we're going to go ahead and create count of equals 0. So oh, this is there we go. So now we've actually gone through and just printed the lists. So just to recap what I did here is I went ahead and created a number up here, which would allow us to keep track of the number of times that it loops through. So if we started at 0 and we know the first loop that count will be 0, it's going to access that index of 0. So we will just keep going. So we'll do, so I will explain to you here what the range value is. I don't think it's going to write. Oh, it did. Okay, perfect. Okay, so ranges. Let's see. Slide on that. Yep. So, let's see. Let's me for a second here. Slide. Got it. Okay, so it's going to start in this grocery list, right? And so then the range just provides where it's going to start. And so then we're going to go ahead and print from those values. And so what we're doing is we're accessing the list of the list. So in this case, X1 we know is always going to be the quantity. And oftentimes, if the data is well organized, especially in a JSON format, we know that consistently for every like feature or record, right, in our database, that we have the same result for every index. So we are good to go there. Okay, we are getting very close to the next part. So a while statement. Let's take a look at whiles. So let's go ahead and again erase the current cell. Looks like we don't need our grocery list anymore. So go ahead and just delete that whole part out. And so go ahead and type I equals 0. So let's go ahead and type while. Yep, there's our green. That's what we're looking for. Then we want to go ahead and print I. Let's go ahead. It's 1. Okay, so if you were to erase this function, which I highly don't recommend, or this statement, excuse me, it's not a function, it's a statement. If you were to erase this statement and you were to just let it run, you'll probably have to close out of your ArcPro and restart it. I have had some issues with doing the stop kernel function when it runs to infinity, but basically what happens here is that it's going to continue to run this statement as long as the condition is true. So it's going to continue to print I until I is greater than or equal to 4. So if I run this 0, 1, 2, 3. So if I change this back to 1, we'll see that it goes all the way up to 4. Well, in this case 3, right? Because it's not equal to 4. So if we want to make it run up until 4, let's see. There you go. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is great for when you're trying to execute a bunch of statements and you want it to end, but you're like trapped inside of a bunch of for loops. That's a lot of times where I use while. You'll see it when we use the search cursor function. Among other ArcPy functions, a lot of times it uses that while loop to go through all the data sets. I'm going to pick up the speed a little bit so we can get into the actual ArcPy language. Date formatting, let's just cover that real quick. Date functions, it's basically, it's an object is what it is. It's not necessarily a data type in Python. It's just an object. So as you can see, when I type in datetime.datetime now, it just go ahead and prints it for me anyways. So in order to go back to the empty cell, let's type print x. So I'm going to go ahead and put x equals datetime.datetime now. Now it'll not print it. Let's go ahead and force it to print it and see how it looks different. So notice how that data was an object, and it has a much different format. And so here you can see that it's got year, comma, month, comma, day, comma, hour, minute, second, milliseconds. And if we print both, well, in this case, it's not going to print it now because I'm calling it x. So x equals, there we go. It shows us our current time. And so if we want to convert it to a string later on or parse it out, we certainly can. Let's go ahead and take a look at how to date some more. Let's first create a date. We already did that. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a second date, and we will just call this, yeah, notice how I'm getting off on my, I try to be as consistent as possible. So if you're using spaces in between variables, I would recommend doing that. Makes it more legible. If you don't want to use spaces, I think that's more common actually, not putting spaces between these. Go ahead and print y. Again, I'm just testing as we go along. There we go. So y is printing us that date. So let's go ahead and subtract the two dates. So go ahead and eliminate that, and let's just do x minus y. So it gave us negative 95 days, so 95 days ago. So let's see what it looks like going this way. Now we've got 94 days with the hours of time. So let's keep going. Okay, so now we can talk a little bit more about how does this, how do we get into more programming concepts? So there's just a couple of things that I want to touch base on, which is we'll talk again very briefly about the GET and POST requests, but first let's talk about object-oriented programming. You might have heard of this before. For short, they call it OOP. It's a programming paradigm, according to W3 Schools, that relies on the concept of classes and objects. It is used to structure a software program into simple, reusable pieces of code blueprints, which are used to create individual instances of objects. Right, like I immediately know what that means. No. So remember how we imported the module datetime? Then we called the object .datetime. And so we actually did not import, so I have to apologize for that. But typically what we do is we import the different modules that we want. So in this case, datetime. Luckily the ArcPy notebook it already comes with all this stuff in it. So a lot of the importing you don't have to do, but there's like JSON stuff like this. We're basically just bringing in these like huge libraries that have things called classes and objects inside of them. And so you'll notice that when we start writing in the ArcPy and starting to go through this fire hydrant data, that you'll notice that it'll say like gis.content.get. whatever. Every dot is accessing a class, or is accessing that GIS class. So like in this case, let me just type this out. This isn't going to work because this is not the correct syntax, but let's just look at what it is that I'm doing, right? GIS in this case would be the class, and then we would be calling a module or a method or a function within that. And so that, again, I don't expect her to be like, oh, I get it right away. We'll just start working with it. And if you're curious about it, just spend some time researching what object-oriented programming is. Yeah, we will go ahead and do our own little object-oriented programming now. So It's not advanced by any means. So let's look at creating a super simple print function. So say we don't want to type out print the parentheses all the time. We want to be able to pass parameters to it. We want to be able to pass an array, etc. Excuse me, a list. And so let's go ahead and create a function. So you start out by defining, right? So def, and then you create the name of the function. So again, it's similar to x, right? We can call it whatever we want. We can call it Frank's function, right? Or we can call it CIS function, whatever we want to call it. In this case, I will call it my function just to keep it simple for us. Let's go ahead and type in print. Oh, there's that green. My function. Okay, so let's see what happens. Why didn't anything happen? Well, that's because we didn't actually execute the function. So in order to execute it, we call it just like we would the other. So it always catches me off guard because I don't think it turns it blue. So I went ahead and called it, and so then it went ahead and executed that function of print my function. Perfect, that's what we wanted. So let's talk about parametric programming. So again, this is on a topic of object-oriented programming, is being able to pass parameters into that function so you can repeatedly use that function over a series of variables. So let's go ahead and look at this. So we can pass a function. So let's go ahead and do x. We're going to say that the parameter that we are passing to it is x. X can be reassigned to anything anytime we call this function. So let's go ahead and do print x. Okay. In this case, what is x? We don't know what x is yet. So I'm going to go ahead and come above my function and say that x equals apples. So when I call that now, it's going to go ahead and run it. Looks like I didn't pass it a variable, right? Let's go ahead and pass it x again. It pulled my value from apples up there, so I assigned a variable to a variable, and it said, okay, we're going to print the value of apples. Can even take that out now. Let's just take that out completely. I don't need to assign it x, right? I don't need to say that x equals apples. In this case, we just type in apples in the function, and it runs just the same. So you can pass any variable you want. If you want to have a list of them, you certainly can. Just do x, y, z, and then we do apples, oranges. I don't. Yep, so I can't do a third one unless I create a third variable, but let's just do apples and oranges. And so I have to also print x and y. If I don't actually call that value, I can't remember. I think in Python it just won't run if I don't. Let's see what happens. Oh, it does allow me to run. In other languages, if you provided this, it won't work because there's certain requirements such as like scope. We didn't talk a whole lot about scope. Python is great in a lot of ways where scope is not as restricting as others. But let's go ahead and talk about like this little issue here about working with the different levels of scope. So returning a value, that's where I was trying to get with scope. So if I want to, instead of printing, I can actually return x. So instead it's going to give me that value. Let's go back and simplify this. Let's go ahead and just return x. So my function, apples, right? What's going to happen? It still gives me 2.4 because it returns that value. We can even do print my function with apples because now it actually returns that value. So because it returns that value, that's all it is. So you don't need to do a print function within if you just want to process a bunch of data. So say we wanted to take apples plus oranges, and then we wanted to use all sorts of different things by adding apples and oranges together. We could print them, we could parse them out, we could create a new list, we can do whatever we want because we're returning it to this function. So we would just call that function, it would give us our value, and we'd process that data. Okay, that's wonderful. So now let's talk about ArcPy. Let's talk about some of these modules. This again is not this is not a complete code here, and I realized with how much time I invested in it that I don't think I would be able to get through all of it. So I did trim it down quite a bit. But we will go line by line and talk about how to access this GIS data. There is a public layer out there that I made available for people to edit and modify, and that's the data that we will access. So I will provide that information as we go along as you need it. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So let's go ahead and look at establishing a connection, right? From arcgis.gis, we're going to import the GIS module. The GIS module is what allows us to actually access the data. So from python.display, this module will allow us to view what we pull in. And if you're wondering where I'm getting all this from, I've already typed it up, but it's all coming from the ArcGIS like developer help pages. And so if you just go in and you Google these things, Esri is great about immediately being the first response. And so you just start digging through the materials and you'll find it that way. They have a great explanation of libraries. They have great samples. And so you can find a lot of that stuff out there. By no means do I know this stuff off the top of my head. I am constantly using Esri libraries. I'm constantly using my personal school books, things like that to remember how to do this. So the next part of calling this module is we actually want to make an anonymous connection to the ArcGIS Online, and that's how you do it by setting a GIS function. Notice how it looks similar to how we created our function earlier, right? This is part of the ArcPy library. So let's go ahead and import JSON. We'll import URL lib.request as a request. And we will also just import requests. That's plural. So let's go ahead and run. Please run it. Make sure that it connects. No module named IPython. Actually, I'm not even sure. Let's see what I did. Yeah, it's still going to tell me no.
Capital P and IPython.
Is it? Dang it.
Yeah. If you do that, it'll work.
Thanks. Is that Curtis? Thank you, Curtis.
Yeah, it's Curtis. Yeah, it worked for me too.
Okay. I was getting nervous there. So, yep. Capital P on Python. You'll notice that I panic entered there. Just take a second here, review what I have before we go on. Notice that I snuck in the ArcPy module. Go ahead and import that. I think it's by default already there as I didn't call it in my other script, but go ahead and import it just to be safe. If I import something more than once, I don't think it gives me an error. Yeah, so it's not like.
Yeah, it doesn't take any time, it just skips it.
Yep.
It's because you might have multiple functions that have to do the import, the reuse, and stuff like that. So it just, if it's already imported, it just skips it.
Perfect. So let's go ahead and jump into the pulling the data down. So let's just search for it, right? So there's a function on the ArcPy where we can just do a search. So type with me here, just like that, capitals and everything. And we are looking for a feature layer. If you don't put this feature layer parameter in there, it will search for maps, whatever, it'll search for everything. So this is an optional parameter. Now that I'm thinking about how I'm presenting this, I would have been good for me to include the parameters that you actually pass to it. So let me just explain for a second. Title, you're passing the actual name of the thing it's looking for, and feature layer is the type of data that it's looking for. So let's go ahead and search for it. Okay, we don't know if it worked, right? So how do we actually check that? Let's go ahead and create a print function. So print, we have, and so what I need to do is actually look into that array, right? So let me just back up a second. I believe if I just type in search underscore results, it provides me this object, right? And so what I want to do is I want to just see how many results I actually got. So we will go back to what I was typing there. And so what I'm doing is I'm creating a string that's going to tell me what we have. So we have, and then I'm concatenating. I have to put a string here because I'm going to create the length of the result. So search underscore results. So here I have the length, and here I'm converting it to a string so I can create that message. So we have 2. I know what we have behind here. So if you have more than 2 or less than 2, something's not right with your query up here. So let's keep going. Auth. And it would probably help to tell you what we're looking for. We're looking for the 2 layers that I published online. One is going to be our authoritative fire hydrant data, and our other is our temporary hydrant data. What we want to do with that data is we actually want to assess it for bad data and send back to the field worker like, hey, here's the list of all the fire hydrants that I would like you to go and find and verify that the information got entered correctly. So let's look at the authoritative data, excuse me, by assigning it this result. And so I know, just because I tested this out earlier, that my second result, in this case, an index of 1, is going to return the authoritative data. If you're not sure what gives you what, that's where we can use the ipython.display. So let's go ahead and just, or even in this case, we don't even need to do that. We can just type in search underscore results. Do 0. I think it just pulls it in. There you go. So it just directly shows you. So we have the temp data here, and we have the authoritative data here. Let's go back to our temporary data. We're assigning our authoritative data. So auth underscore data underscore ID. You can call it something else if you prefer something shorter, but that's what I'm calling it. So what we're going to do is we're actually just getting a search result, which means that we're going to get the URL, but this is actually not the feature layer yet. So let's go ahead and do auth underscore data, and let's use our module, the gis.content.get. We need the underscore data underscore ID, and then we're accessing within that object the ID itself. In this case, a lot of us might be familiar with the URL schema, right? In collector survey 123, when we want to pass data back and forth, that host and feature layer has that long string at the end that is the ID of it. So if we want to access it, we need that ID. So we'll go ahead and run that and test it. It's still saying that we have 2. I'm going to go ahead and just Put this down here so I can keep.
Hey, Frank, this is Curtis.
Yep. Go ahead.
You can hear me okay, right?
Yep.
That item ID, is that big long hairy ID that's in when you go to the item content page in ArcGIS Online, you get a big long URL? That's
Yes.
that same number.
Does
Okay.
that answer your question?
I think it does.
Why don't we print it? You guys want to print it? Let's print it. So if I print it, be like, yeah, that's definitely what it is, right? Oh crap. Let's see.
You just add the .id to it.
Yeah, I thought I just did print off data, which of course it's still in an object, so I know I have it in here as we go along. We'll keep going along, but let me pull up a example, Curtis. That was a good question. So I'll just show you my super sloppy ArcGIS Online. This is the part you're referring to, right?
Yep, that's it.
Yep. So
We've all seen that before.
yes, and yep. And you can access it too down here by going into view. And so actually, I'm glad you asked that, Curtis, because we're going to talk about the next part too is right now, all we're doing is we're accessing this page, but what we need to do is we need to get this layer, because in hosted feature layers, as we all know, that it's not like regular ArcGIS or ArcMap or ArcPro where we have all our layers in our content pane. In this case, we have to actually access that hosted feature layer to get to the individual level, that individual layer. So we will keep working and we will get to that point. So see that we're approaching about, maybe 30 minutes left. So I'm going to speed up. So I'll make sure to send out this code here at the end and make it available to everybody. So let's go ahead and keep going. So I think I just did this so we could see, yep. So I'm just seeing that the function's running. That's all I'm doing there. You don't actually need to put auth data there, but it just helps to check as you work this whole thing. So let's go ahead and do search underscore. So if you want to, you can copy and paste this and just start replacing it with the temp variable. Because that is all we're doing. We're just getting the temp data staged, essentially. So again, we're getting the data by calling that variable. Let's make sure that it works. Look at that, it works. If you want to see both of them, you'll have to put them down into a separate cell. Or you'll have to create an IPython function that displays them both. So let's go ahead and split them out so you can see them. So now we have it, right? There it is. But now we need to access the actual content within it. So let's go ahead and create an authoritative data feature class. Everyone's familiar with feature classes, right? So I like to use, and Esri also likes to use in their samples, FC for feature class. It's just so simple, straightforward. I use it for every time I work on a feature class. It's just great. So auth data layers, and I will explain this in a second. I'm going kind of fast. So what I'm doing is I'm creating that feature class by accessing that layer within this particular content. If I wanted to, I could write this out as one big long string, but that's not what we're doing. Essentially, you could keep going if you wanted to. You could go forever. It helps to break it down and test things this way. So in this case, we're accessing layers, and then Curtis, again, this is where I was trying to get that URL for you. If we go ahead and just print auth underscore FC, now it should give us that URL that we were looking for. There it is.
That's great. So that's the one that we saw on the REST page we were just looking at. There was a link for the feature class.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. There it is. Yep. So it's the computer address to go find it.
Yes. That's a good point. That took me forever to figure out. First time I
I
was
tell
working on
people
this
that
stuff.
second page we were looking at is the kind of the one for computers to read, get all the info for programmers and stuff like that. And the item info page that we've all looked at that has the metadata right there and all that kind of stuff, that's for humans.
Yep.
So
Those are
they're kind
all
of two different pages for the same thing, and one is kind of for programmers and computers, and the other one is for just looking at for people.
and they call that the
Different.
REST service, right, Curtis?
Yeah, the REST
This,
service endpoint. Yeah, that's the fancy name for this. Yeah.
yep. Thanks for your help, Curtis. I wasn't planning
Sure.
on having backup today, so that was kind of a last minute thought that I had is, oh crap, I should have found a volunteer to help me. So thank you very much. It's been very helpful.
Well, you just did those typos just so we'd all learn. That's okay.
Now you're giving me too much credit. Okay. Let's go ahead and keep on going. So again, we're back on that REST service page, or as Curtis was talking about just a second there, right? That's where I'm getting that 0. This is the first item in the list, and Esri is oh so nice of just saying, hey, item 0 is right here. So that's what we're accessing here, is we're getting both of those URLs, so then we can actually put it into our geoprocessing functions now. So let's look at the available fields in these guys, right? Let's make sure we have the right data. So I'm going to go ahead and run that print. So I think in here I have just at the top. Oh, no, everything's there. Okay. So in order to access the field names, there's another object, excuse me, that we're going to call. So we'll go ahead and print f in see if I got that right. Looks like I did. And another reason why I want to print these out for us is because we are going to need some of these fields. So we need to make sure that we enter them here. And, you know, there's probably a faster way of doing this too, again, where I talked about writing better code. This would be a good example of where you might want to create a function. So I don't need to type in for f in arcpy da 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 da. Instead, I might want to create a function.
And yeah. Those of you that are kind of new to this, I think I just want to throw out that this is like that for loop we did before, except it's kind of done on one line in kind of a shorthand. And they call it a list comprehension. You might run into that some help somewhere. But basically, we're going through that list field, gives us a list of fields, which are objects. They have lots of properties. The name is just one of the things, like the type and the width and the date, all that, whether it's writable or not, all kinds of stuff. But the name is all we want to see. So f.name just pulls the name off the field object. This is a quick way to list the fields. And it isn't like you memorize this. We normally copy and paste some stuff from examples in the help and things.
Yes, that's exactly what
Right,
I'm doing.
great.
I'm just,
Good programmers copy, great programmers steal.
yep. Stack Overflow, man, that's, yeah, that kind of goes back to my Frankenstein story a little bit about how when I didn't really know what I was doing, I was copying, pasting, programming, almost like abusing it, in some ways. It got the job done, but I didn't really understand what was going on. Okay, so we have our list fields for the authoritative data in the first line here, or in the first set. And in the second set, we have the temporary data. So let's keep going. I'm going to go ahead and create some blank lists. In some cases, you have to start out with declaring a blank variable. It's not very often that you do that in Python. But in this case, this is just the solution I found to work with. This is what I'm going with. So let's go ahead and let's call another function here, the search cursor. The search cursor is going to run through all of our records. And so this gives us access to each record within that feature class. So then we can look at it row by row and field by field if we choose to. So let's go ahead and, so in the first argument, or excuse me, parameter, we are going to put the temporary feature class because this is the one that I want to go through and look to see if the data is bad, because the layer that the field crew would be using in this case is this temp feature class. That's what they're using in order to get their data. So I want to see real quickly, like which hydrants do they have that just have missing data? And so that's just all we're going to look at today, basically. So let's keep going. And so the next parameter is the fields that we actually want to look through. You could create a parameter up here and you could call fields and you could enter them in that way. But in this case, because I'm not repetitively having to call that set of fields, I'm going to go ahead and just type it right in. And you'll notice too, I'm calling the object ID. I'm going to get that in order to refer to the fire hydrants. In most cases, it's better to have a hydrant ID or give them a global ID. Or in the best scenario, you would generate a collector URL or a survey 123 URL using those global IDs to pass it back. But we're just going to create a very simple list today in order to do that. And that'll make more sense if we make it to the post and get part of this. So just kind of rush through this.
While he's typing, I thought I'd just throw out that with this with statement he's doing, if you go look up ArcPyDA search cursor in the help, this is a very common pattern, and you can just copy and paste it out of the help. This with the for loop after it, and it's the way you basically walk through a table row by row. This is the method you use to do that. And because it's a search cursor, it means it's like a read-only access to the table row by row.
And another thing too is another thing that I added in here is I found this out the hard way. I was constantly, so what I want to do is I want to look for blank or null records, right? I'm looking for bad data. And so to me, bad data is just no data. And I found out the hard way that none is different than blank. You can have, like, for example, we know what null is, right? In this case, null is none. In the case where you have a blank, you would have to type in the string. So you'll see that I do it twice, just to make sure that they didn't accidentally go into the field, submit it, and then instead of a not null, they have just nothing there. So I will just keep going. And so I didn't talk about or statements. A lot of us, I think, are familiar with the and or statements. In this case, I'm just checking to see that each field for that particular row is not none.
Right. So rows at 0. That's basically you have a little list. It's all the data for that row of data. So row sub 0 is the object ID for that row. Row sub 1 is the hydrant make for that row. Row sub 2 is the location for that row. Right.
Yep. Exactly.
That's how this is working.
Yep. Right. So this might say object ID of 1. This would say hydrous or waterous, excuse me, clo valve. And this one might say, right, like 316th Street, and this might say like 6-inch main line. So a main line, excuse me, that's just the size of pipe that comes into that fire hydrant. So We'll
Are you
keep
checking
going.
whether any of them are none? Do you need an equal none, equal none at the end there?
Oh, yeah. Yep. You're right. I should just be copying and pasting. Should have sent this out too. So I'm gonna speed it up and just start copying and pasting some of this stuff because I'd really like to show the post request stuff. That was I think very useful. So yep.
Okay,
So
so you're making a list of object IDs that are naughty and a list of object IDs that are nice.
exactly. And so that's where the bad data is getting put into the, yep, naughty and nice list. I should have called it, yes, Santa's naughty and nice list. So let's go ahead and keep on going. Oh yeah, I want to look to see, hey, did I do this right? Okay, looks like, what did I do here? Okay, hold on. So
You're missing equals none in the list, I think.
in the list, I'm missing an equal sign.
You say rows of two should also have an equals none on it. You say or rows of two or rows of three in the list there.
Just
In your list of or statements, I think one of them is different. Oh, here you go.
no, it's still okay.
That's still doing it.
I'm gonna just keep going, I guess. So basically, all we were trying to do there is just get the bad data and the good data. It looks like I see what let's go ahead. Nope, it's still just printing it. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving along here. It's complete in a different document. Let me just yeah, okay, seen some stuff. Still not working. Okay, well, oh, I remember what I did now. Okay, we just weren't there yet. So if I print, I will back up here. Maybe it's because they don't have object IDs, but that can't be. Okay, well, what it was supposed to do is it was actually supposed to give me that object ID value because we know that object ID here is supposed to be, maybe that's the problem, is the field name does not match. So it looks like it does. I'm going to just add this data in real quick and just verify that it's right. It could be that I typed object ID with all capitals, but that's how it's entered here. So let's go on.
Typed mine with capitals and I got numbers for the results, so I'm not sure it's different yet.
So let's see if I spelled object ID wrong. Nope. Okay, well, we'll keep going along here. But what was supposed to happen is it was supposed to find the data that had none, and then it was supposed to pull in row 0, which again we decided was the object ID. So this should be reading, oh, you know what? This what I did wrong? Nope. Okay. Sometimes rerunning all your code will make it work. So anyways, I'll keep going here. Okay, we can finally get to the part that I like. Let's go ahead and talk about the post and get requests. And Curtis, you have a better explanation of this. Certainly jump in, but my understanding of a get request is that we can access like data or information from a API. An API is like what allows us to get the data off like the REST service and things like that, get it from other web pages. Like here's a really good example, right? When you go onto Google and you just type in like, I want to fly from Sioux Falls to Rapid City, it's going to give you a list of flights, right? It's using a GET request in order to get that information. Then when you want to go reserve your flight, you're actually posting some data out to their database after you make that purchase. So then they put your name in that database saying that Frank went out and bought a ticket from Sioux Falls to Rapid City for X amount of dollars. And so you're posting that data. In this case, we can send a post request out to our Integromat account. And so I will just post that code right in here. And so we'll go ahead and create that post request. So that's where we are importing these modules up here, this import requests function. We'll go ahead and assign a URL. So in order to get this URL, you actually have to go into Integromat and create that. So if everyone would take a second and open up your Integromat account again, just refresh your home page to make sure that it didn't time out and log you out. And then go ahead and go into the dashboard page if you're not already there. Go ahead, click on create a new scenario. And what we want here is if you use Gmail, you'll have to pull up the Gmail one. In my case, if I use like Office 365, it's not actually called Outlook, it's called 365. So just type in that and you'll get your Microsoft email. So you'll choose that. And then the next one we want is called webhooks. Webhooks is what will process our post request. So go ahead and click on continue. So here's webhooks. I'm going to go ahead and choose creates a response to a webhook. Or wait, no. That is not what we want. Second here. We want custom webhook. I'm sorry about that. Custom webhook. I got talking about responses and then all of a sudden I was like, yep, response. That is not the case. So let's go ahead and give it a name. Honestly, the default's just fine, but if you're working with lots of data sets, you might want to call this like fire hydrant. And so we don't have any IP restrictions. If you want to learn more about that, Integromat has more information on that. If you're doing this on Power Automate, it should be a fairly similar process for doing this, because what it'll do now is it'll give us this URL, right? This is what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that address. And go back. I'm even just going to pull up my other notebook so you guys can see this working. So okay, so here's an example of where I actually got the data up and running. Same notebook. This part. So there's a part that I needed. So hopefully we got everybody back to this page now. Go back inside of your notebooks if you haven't already and paste that URL right into the URL parameter. And so now what we need to do is we need to actually create a JSON. Okay, we need to create a JSON format. There's different ways to create JSON formats where we can take our list, for example, and we can use JSON dump. In this case, I just wanted to erase as many, I guess, trip ups as I was having with using this stuff by just creating a JSON on my own. So a JSON format, let me just pull up an example. Is essentially you have like what's called dictionaries. And so when you call an item, you know, you've got glossary, and then within glossary, you have the title, and within example glossary, you have all these dividers, and then eventually get down to actually what you're looking for inside of those JSONs. Here's another one, right? Like we might see this when we do like inspect. Some of us have seen some of these within like elements, things like that. It's just how we organize the data. Very simply, it's just it's another form of a database, right? It's some people call it a dummy database. Some people call it a NoSQL database. It's just a way to access, like for example, this could be a feature, and then within that field you would have this record, like click here, size 36, style, bold, etc. So that's what we're doing here is we're just assigning those values to what's called my object. You can call it whatever you want, but that's just the JSON, right? If you want to call it JSON. I wouldn't recommend calling variables things that have like keywords as they call them. So I would, you know, if you want to call it JSON, call it my JSON, not just JSON. And so then create a left curly bracket here, and then create a an item called email, and then assign it a value by typing in colon, and then put whoever's email you want to put. That's who we're going to send it to, right? And actually, I'll send this over to my work email. So this is where we're going to send it to, and then here's our bad data. And so essentially, to get our bad data into the JSON, we just take our variable from up here, put it in there, and then we create the request. And so request.post, post the request. And so when we go ahead and run, take this out, I was missing something down here. I'm going to go ahead and run all. So it'll just take a second. You should get a response of 200. That's a good sign. And so we want to go back into where this is at. See how I had a 1 there? We'll go ahead, and that means that I got the structure. See how it says successfully determined. We're good to go. That means that the structure has been figured out. Go ahead and add in the module. And so we want to send a message, create and send a message. So what this webhooks does is it just automates some basic things for us. Of course, I gotta log in account here side.
If this is cool, I mean, I've tried to send emails in Python, and it depends on your local system configuration altogether. Here, you're taking a website to go ahead and send an email to someone, so you don't need to worry about your local machine setup or anything.
And Curtis, that's exactly why I'm doing it this way, because if you try doing this through notebooks, it is insanely hard doing the email server. So I stumbled across this. I feel you there on the local machine thing. It's, if you want to talk about that for a second, Curtis, about the Python email thing, that would be great.
Well, there are Python modules to do 5 billion things, and one of them is their modules that will do mail for you. But of course, they require that your operating system mail, your default mail server is set up, and all kinds. Sometimes you don't have permission and all this kind of stuff. So this method is really much preferable. And there are a lot of different things. You might have seen the word webhook when you were looking at our Survey 123 and Collector and stuff like that, because that's how those platforms send emails to people too. There are little places where you can plug in these you can set up a webhook to do something and send some data to it. But yeah, this is nifty.
And of course, it's not up and running the way I want it to, but let's see. Okay, it wants me to save stuff. This module is not set up. Save anyways. Yep. Let's see if we can get it running. Sure. Also, I don't recommend working in 4 ArcPy or ArcPro windows at once. It's kind of a idea. Okay. So that URL is good. Let's just run this whole thing again. Force it to give me that response. There we go. Okay. There we go. See how it's starting to pull in now? So here's our email item that we called, and then here's the bad data. So I just want this to be in the body of the message. And then I want to send it to the person that I have assigned in the email function. And I'll say Frank is the name. Go ahead, hit OK. And now we can run it. And it should, if I come back here, I think I got to run it one more time. Oh. Okay, and then get it on my phone here in just a second. Well, should be working, but nonetheless, let me just show you an example email that I got from it. Oh, double click, there we go. So apparently they need to go find 112 hydrants that they entered incorrectly. I intentionally left it that way. That's just, it was just meant to show you how many, how you get the data out. So yeah, that was kind of tricky, but I hope that if you don't fully understand everything, at least you walk away being able to go and research some of these things. Even just knowing what's out there can tremendously help you. So I hope that everyone learned something today, and I was I'm very thankful for Curtis for your help today on that. That was
Well,
very
thank you. I
helpful.
learned a lot too. I've been kind of scared of that ArcGIS module where you can talk to ArcGIS online and hadn't had a chance to mess with it much. And it's really pretty cool the way you can search things and grab a, run a search to find something. And that search function, you can also pass it like if you go to ArcGIS online and you have that identifier number, you could just search on that to get exactly the thing you wanted. But the advantage of searching by title means if someone takes it down and reposts it, that number changes. So this is cool. I've learned a lot of little things I didn't know.
Thank you. Yeah, that concludes it. If anybody has any questions.
You're getting lots of claps there, Frank. So very well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It made me really nervous doing a live demo of coding. So I'm surprised I had as few errors as I did. So
you did great. You did great. There's nothing worse than I always, even if I'm doing something in GIS that I've done a million times, if somebody's standing behind me while I'm doing it, I fat finger absolutely everything. No, you did awesome. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. If not, and if you think of it later, feel free to send it to me and I will make sure that Frank gets the question. I'm happy to share that. But I guess otherwise, this is the end of our workshops for today. Oh, that's right. I did have a question that Curtis had sort of brought up earlier. Curtis wants to talk about the notebook improvements that went into place in ArcGIS Pro 2.8. So I think I'll split this up to both Frank and Curtis. Number one, Frank, what version of ArcGIS Pro were you using? And then when you're done, Curtis, do you want to follow up with your comments on Notebook?
let's take a look because I'm not even sure. Probably the most up-to-date version. I usually run the most up-to-date. So yep, 2.80.
Curtis,
Yeah,
did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, the one I just wanted to say that, I've been following I'm a beta tester and stuff, and 2.8 has a lot of improvements to the notebook. It's a lot more solid than it used to be, and it's a little cleaner and works a little faster and stuff like that. So some of these things, it's really good to get to the latest version of things. And that's always a hard thing, what version to use, because like we set up, we don't like to have, by default when you install Pro, it'll prompt you to update the software. But if you're in the middle of a project, that's not always the best thing to do. so it's a tough thing. But in terms of these notebooks, if you're an old version of Pro, you really want to get updated to the most recent 2.8.
Yeah, definitely guilty, and I need to upgrade my Pro. So just saying on that. And then Frank,
Don't you just get excited? Don't you get excited when they're? I can't wait to download the next version every time. So
I seem to always run into like an issue. So I admit I always have to drag my feet on it. I feel like every other Pro upgrade likes to break my massive address locators that I like punch into this huge composite. So I admit I tend to be a little bit leery sometimes. But then of course there's something I need in an upgrade, right? So I always have to go ahead. Frank, one last thing from one of our attendees. Will you be providing your code, and or how would you like to get me your code and I can share it with others as needed, or I can share it with our conference downloads as well? How would you like to share that with the group?
whatever's easiest, I can email it to. Who should I email it to?
If you would like, feel free to email it to me, and then I'll make sure I get it to, looks like I have one person for sure who would like me to send it to them, and I can do that directly. My email, let me put this in here first for you. 1 second, I had already here. I'm just going to hit enter on this in the chat. I have the link to the next session, or to our last session.
Okay.
And then Frank, if you just want to send it right here for now, and then I'll make sure all the requesters get it. And then I think that was Kevin who was requesting. Kevin, as soon as I get that code, I'll be sure to forward it to you because I do have all of the attendees' emails as well.
Thank you.
You bet.
Yep. Happy to hear people want to look at it. So
You bet. All right, everybody. Well, we better head over to our last keynote of the conference. Lots of claps for Frank Parker. Really appreciated your Python workshop today. If anybody has any questions, throw it in the chat, although I will be shutting this down shortly, but feel free to email me or any of your conference materials too, which has our group emails in them. You may certainly do that as well. Thank you, everybody, very much. Great having you here today.
thank you, everybody. Thanks for all the encouragement.
Always, always, always. See you in the next room.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.